Now, you are looking right now, these are pictures from Manhattan's Foley Square, where several pro-immigration groups have gathered. They're protesting the high court's ruling. Right now, I want to bring in our legal panel, Greg Jarrett, Fox News correspondent, former defense attorney, also author of the soon-to-be-released book, The Russian Hoax, the illicit scheme to clear Hillary Clinton and frame Donald Trump. Also joining us, Josh Blackman, South Texas College law professor, also a Cato Institute adjunct scholar. Greg, let me start with you. I thought that, I guess for me, the thing that stood out as a novice, the Chief Justice Roberts saying that in the majority opinion, that the order was, quote, squarely within the scope of presidential authority. Was that the central issue here?
It really was. And this was such an easy case for the Supreme Court to decide. I realize 4 justices dissented, but honestly, based on the law, the president was following it. 1952 Act of Congress conferred authority on the president in matters of national security and safety of Americans. And so this president, followed the law. And it was always a silly, specious argument to claim that it was a discriminatory Muslim ban. If you look at the top 10 Muslim countries in the world, only one is on the list, Iran. 92% of Muslims all over the world are unaffected by this decision. Those countries that are on the list are simply countries that either harbor terrorists, support terrorists, or tolerate terrorists, and they do not assist the United States in doing background checks and vetting. So in order to prevent potential terrorists from coming to the U.S., they're on the list.
Josh, and yet you have Cory Booker, among many others, saying this somehow has made our country less safe.
You know, this decision really isn't surprising. In December 2017, the Supreme Court let this policy go into effect temporarily. And in March 2018, at the argument, at least 5 justices signaled that they were okay with this policy. The policy has now been in effect for the better part of half a year. And I think it will remain in effect throughout President Trump's administration. The key point here is the court held that the president has both the statutory and the constitutional authority to implement this ban. And I think it can go forward as stated.
You know, so you say it was simple, Greg, but it was 5-4.
Right, but that's politics on the Supreme Court.
Right. I mean, but does, for instance, okay, Sotomayor, who was extraordinarily vocal about this, she compared it, the parallels to the 1944 decision, Karematsu versus United States. Of course, that was a presidential order requiring the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II.
Yeah, she's wrong because that affected Americans. These are people who are not Americans and don't have constitutional rights. These are people outside our country, many of whom may be potential terrorists, and the president has an affirmative duty. His primary duty is to protect American citizens from forces outside our borders, and that's what he is doing by this. The decision she cited had to do with internment of Americans who were here.
Sure. I mean, we were distinctly treating Japanese on Okinawa that we were fighting a war with differently than Japanese Americans. And of course, even the court said they denounced it. They said it was gravely wrong on the day it was decided, but that had nothing to do with this particular case.
Yes. And, you know, Sotomayor is also somebody who was relying a lot on the rhetoric of the campaign trail, the words uttered by then candidate Trump, now President Trump. SCOTUS has always been reluctant to use campaign rhetoric as a basis for making a decision because, for the most part, it's neither relevant nor dispositive. It's just rhetoric.
Josh, squarely within the scope of presidential authority, these executive orders, now people are wondering what exactly President Trump can use them for, and could he actually apply executive orders to cure his problems with the border situation?
Well, the court here was very careful to say that the executive power here concerns denying entry. There's a difference in law between denying someone entry to the country and once they're in the country, different sets of laws apply to them. The court held that if you're trying to get into this country, you have a much smaller set of rights than those already here. So I think the calls that this will spread elsewhere and give President Trump a lot more authority is probably misguided. But the big point is the Supreme Court didn't strike down what President Trump did. Had the court ruled that Trump was acting unlawfully, I think that would have been open season on the administration, and one judge after another would have struck down everything he does in immigration. So at least this, I think, maintains the status quo. It might even be a net positive for other immigration issues.
So, Greg, it goes back to a lower court.
Right.
How does that work now? Because from what I've read, they have to use the interpretation of the Supreme Court. So even with these activist judges, you know, will that sort of mitigate their attempts or their political leanings, which have played a big role in this?
It should, but it may not, because they're so politically driven, especially those judges in the Ninth Circuit, the so-called Nutty Ninth. And I can say that because I used to practice in the Ninth Circuit. This was a preliminary injunction initially, which is a temporary hold. So the court reversed and remanded back to the lower courts, consistent with our opinions stated today. So that means that the lower courts have to reconsider. They'll probably hold a miniature trial, a hearing on the merits of the case. But their decision must be consistent with what the justices have ruled today.
So you think ultimately this is the way it ultimately will.
You'll find some renegade judge who will take issue and find some circuitous method to strike down the ban. It'll work its way through the courts. It'll go back to the Supreme Court, and the same decision will be rendered.